Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a plunge into a collection of sources exploring something really fundamental, often pretty complex to men's emotional worlds.
Yeah, and how they navigate relationships, the whole area of self-care, or maybe the lack of it sometimes, and, what the paths might look like towards healing and building stronger connections.
It's a really vital topic, and we've got quite a mix of material in front of us today, haven't we?
We really do. It's quite rich. There are some incredibly raw personal stories shared online in forums and communities. Then there are insights from, more formal research studies looking at relationships, breakups.
And articles, too, from mental health and wellness publications, people really digging into the theory and practice.
Exactly. So our goal really for this deep dive is to, well, guide you through what these sources are telling us. We want to unpack the challenges men often face.
Understand the ripple effects, right?
Yeah.
Not just on them, but significantly on their relationships.
hmm And importantly, shine a light on the avenues for growth, for healing that are highlighted across all these different perspectives in the material.
So think of this as us looking beneath the surface together, drawing directly from these experiences and this expertise to really get a handle on the dynamics at play.
Absolutely. We're exploring personal well-being, intimate relationships, all from the vantage point offered in these specific sources. So should we dive in?
Let's do it. Okay, so this first big theme feels really foundational in the sources, this idea of the deep roots of pain and trauma, how past experiences, shape the present. What stood out to you there?
Well, it's striking how the sources make it clear this isn't just abstract, it's deeply felt. One really powerful example is the story of Liam. He talked about this overwhelming feeling. Guilt and shame completely engulfed me, he said, after his father died.
And the source connected that directly too.
To his perceived failure in what he saw as his personal mission, trying to save his father from addiction.
Wow. That's just an immense psychological weight, isn't it?
Yeah.
A child feeling responsible for an adult struggle like that. The source really paints a picture of that burden.
It does. And it wasn't just the guilt for Liam, according to the source. It describes a really chaotic internal state resulting from this trauma.
Like a roller coaster.
Kind of, yeah. The account details this difficult oscillation. Moments that were panic-inducing, just sheer overwhelming anxiety, followed almost immediately by others that felt overwhelming in a different way, maybe like a flood of emotion, too much to process.
And then the shift.
Yeah.
Almost like a defense mechanism against all that chaos.
Exactly. The description moves to a state he called total bodily numbness, a complete void of emotion.
The numbness.
Yeah. The source interprets this as a form of dissociation, a disconnection from feelings, from your body, even your surroundings, as a way to cope with unbearable stress.
It's like a protective shutdown.
Right. But it's not sustainable in the long run. And as the source notes, it ultimately led to a significant breakdown for him.
So you have this intense overwhelm, then this complete shutdown, both stemming from that deep trauma and that feeling of failure. It sounds utterly exhausting and frankly isolating.
It really does. And we see a different angle on this kind of emotional turmoil in another story from the sources, this one from a Reddit user. This person described feeling horribly confused with shattered confidence.
This was after a relationship with someone described as emotionally unavailable.
Yes, exactly. And they used this incredibly vivid analogy.
The Charlie Brown one.
That's the one, feeling like Charlie Brown and she was Lucy pulling away the emotional connection football. Just brilliant. Every time they tried to get close, build intimacy, they were met with withdrawal, unavailability.
Leaving them constantly off balance, hopeful 1 second, crashing the next.
Precisely. And the confusion wasn't just about the other person's behavior, the source suggests, but about their own worth, their own judgment, after trying and failing to connect over and over. Oh, absolutely. That cycle, having your hopes repeatedly dashed, especially when you're seeking connection, it can completely shatter your confidence, makes you question everything. It's another way. Deep emotional pain isn't always a single event, but can be compounded by these relational dynamics.
And these personal stories, they really powerfully illustrate what the more research-focused parts of our sources talk about regarding trauma's lasting impact.
Right.
One article puts it very directly. Trauma leaves a trail of unhealed psychological injuries that persist into adulthood and wreak havoc on life and health.
Wreak havoc, strong words.
They are.
Yeah.
And the insight isn't just that trauma hurts in the moment. It's that its impact gets woven into the fabric of adult life, affecting health, relationships, patterns of behavior, sometimes years or even decades later. It's not just history. It's an ongoing presence for many.
But crucially, the sources balance this, don't they? They emphasize that while that trail can be long, it doesn't have to be a dead end. That's vital, yes. They note that healing, especially from the kind of relationship trauma that Reddit user described, is definitely a journey. It unfolds over time.
And it's not always straightforward.
No, the sources are clear. It might not be linear. There will be ups and downs, steps forward, maybe some steps back. But recovery is consistently presented as possible. That's a key message throughout the material.
That message of possibility is so important. And connecting these really personal, sometimes agonizing stories, like Liam's or the Reddit users, to the broader patterns that the research identifies. Well, it helps contextualize things, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows these aren't just isolated incidents of, personal failure or weakness. They're often quite common human responses to traumatic or really challenging experiences.
Understanding that shared pattern, knowing that dissociation or shattered confidence after certain relationship dynamics is a known response that can be incredibly validating.
Absolutely. And it feels like the first vital step towards finding that path to healing the sources talk about. It helps shift the perspective from what's wrong with me towards, okay, what happened to me and how can I start to heal?
Which is a massive shift.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that understanding of the internal landscape shaped by past pain, how do the sources say this interacts with the external world? Specifically, those cultural pressures, the unspoken rules men often face.
Right. This is where the societal dimension really comes into focus in the material.
Mhm.
The sources strongly highlight how these external expectations profoundly shape men's emotional expression and how they show up in relationships.
There was that blunt quote.
Yes, one article says boys and men are often taught to block their emotions and automatically mimic an externalized playbook of what it means to be a man.
An externalized playbook. That's such a striking phrase.
Isn't it? It really suggests that masculinity, or at least the expression of it, is often less about authentic feeling and more about performing according to a societal script. It's learned behavior.
And part of that script, that playbook, involved these man rules the sources mention.
Exactly. These informal, often completely unspoken rules. And a dominant one is the expectation for men to always be strong and not ask for help.
So needing help, or even just asking for it, gets framed as weakness within that cultural view.
Pretty much, yeah. The material points out that asking for help is often explicitly seen as a sign of weakness. So the very act of reaching out, which is so fundamental for healing, for connection, is culturally coded as a failure.
That's a terrible bind to be in.
It is. And the sources highlight that men are often never rewarded for demonstrating vulnerability. Just think about it in many traditional male spaces, showing emotional openness, admitting uncertainty. It's rarely met with praise or encouragement.
Sometimes the opposite, right? Discouraged, maybe even ridiculed.
Implicitly, if not explicitly. Men are, as one source puts it, not taught to share, lean on others, and communicate intimately. These skills, which are absolutely vital for emotional health and good relationships, just aren't part of the traditional curriculum for boys and men.
Which brings us squarely to shame. The sources identify this as a core issue stemming from these cultural pressures. It's not just fearing external judgment, but this deep internalized feeling.
Absolutely. And there's a really fascinating point the sources make here, specifically around men's health. They discuss conditions like MS. Now, clinical depression is found pretty much equally in men and women with MS. But,
Men react differently.
well, the source says men are less likely to view depression as a source of shame and are less likely to seek assistance compared to women. Now, actually, let me reread that. It says, less likely to view depression as a source of shame and less likely to seek assistance. That sounds a bit contradictory at first glance. Okay, looking at the broader context in the source, I think the nuance is this. It's not that they don't feel any shame related to it, but perhaps the act of having depression, and especially the act of needing or seeking help for it, becomes the primary source of shame, because that violates the man rules about being strong and self-reliant.
Ah, I see. So the shame isn't necessarily about the depression itself, but about the perceived weakness associated with having it and needing help for it, according to those cultural rules.
Exactly. That clarifies it. Thanks. It makes the point much sharper. It shows directly how cultural norms around masculinity and broader social expectations actively contribute to self-neglect. The source material connects this right back to the belief that showing any vulnerability, whether it's admitting depression, physical pain, emotional need, is inherently weak and therefore shameful.
That internalized belief, if I'm vulnerable, I'm weak, and being weak is shameful.
Precisely. And the sources make a really helpful distinction here to understand it better, the difference between healthy shame and toxic shame.
Okay, what's the difference according to them?
Well, healthy shame is described as that feeling we get when our actions don't align with our own values, like when we act like a lesser version of ourselves. The sources suggest this kind of shame can actually be useful, a signal, a motivator to change our behavior, apologize, make amends, get back in line with our values. It's a feeling about something we did.
Like, oof, I shouldn't have snapped like that, and feeling bad about the action prompts you to do better next time.
Exactly. But toxic shame, as the sources define it, is fundamentally different. It stems from those unhealthy cultural messages about masculinity, that constant pressure to perform strength, suppress emotion, never need anyone. This kind of shame isn't about a specific action, it's about your fundamental being.
It attacks the self.
Right. It makes men feel inherently flawed or bad for being human, for having normal emotions, needing connection, needing support. It's a feeling about who you are, judged against these external, often impossible standards.
That's a critical difference. Toxic shame makes you feel fundamentally unworthy. And the sources even gave that specific, almost surprising example of how this internalized shame can manifest physically, didn't they?
Yeah, that anecdote from the online forum about struggling with eye contact. This person described this lifelong pattern of unintentionally looking down when talking to other men, feeling embarrassed by it, and connecting it to this deeper discomfort, this shame in those male-to-male interactions.
It's such a small detail, but so powerful. It shows how these big, abstract cultural forces and toxic shame can play out in really subtle, everyday body language, how deep that discomfort with just being seen can run.
It really brings it down to a personal level, and the sources also dig into internalized guilt, especially around understanding one's place in, well, societal systems.
This part felt particularly complex and maybe challenging to grapple with.
It can be. It discusses the experience some men have when they start to realize they might be, often unintentionally, part of the problem by helping to propagate structural ideas rooted in patriarchy.
Right. It's not about being intentionally malicious, but recognizing how societal structures might disadvantage others and how your own actions, even passive ones, might uphold those structures.
Exactly. And the sources describe the internal conflict this can spark. If you see yourself as a good person, realizing you might have been complicit in systems that cause harm even just by not questioning them can lead to significant guilt. You start questioning your own moral virtue.
That internal dialogue the source mentions, wait, I can't be a bad person, but these are bad things. Have I been bad all along?
Which sounds a lot like that good-bad binary thinking the sources talk about.
Everything has to be one or the other, black or white, good person or bad person.
Yes, and the sources frame that immediate jump, oh no, I must be bad, as an example of that limiting binary thinking. It leaves no space for nuance, for the difference between intent and impact, or for the idea that you can be a generally good person who has still benefited from or unintentionally supported harmful systems.
So how do the sources suggest navigating that tough realization without getting totally stuck in self-blame?
They offer a really crucial perspective, the idea of separating your sense of self from the series of identities that underline who you are.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Well, the core insight seems to be that it's possible to critically examine social dynamics, cultural programming, even the roles you've played within those dynamics, like, say, the identity of being male in a society with patriarchal structures, without that examination feeling like a personal attack on your entire being.
So you can analyze the system and your part in it without it automatically meaning I am fundamentally a bad person.
Exactly. It creates a bit of mental space. Space for understanding, for growth, rather than immediate defensiveness or just feeling paralyzed by guilt.
Which seems much more productive.
Right. And the sources add another important point about guilt itself. While feeling it initially might be necessary when you recognize harm, they suggest it's often not a very useful long-term motivator.
That's better then.
Focusing instead on empathy, on understanding the impact on others, and on taking constructive, positive action. That's presented as a much more effective and sustainable path towards change, towards contributing to a better way of doing things.
Moving beyond guilt towards empathy and action.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This leads us directly into the next section, which really connects these internal struggles and external pressures to their tangible impact, especially in relationships, through the lens of self-care and communication.
Yes, this is where, the rubber meets the road in the sources. They really highlight how men's often neglected self-care habits stemming from those man rules and that internalized shame we talked about don't just impact the man himself, they significantly affect partners and the whole relationship dynamic.
The story of Michael really brought this home.
It did. The source describes his pattern: skipping regular medical checkups, brushing off obvious fatigue, relying on a poor diet. And the key point wasn't just that he got sick.
Right, it was the consequence.
Yes. It led to a diabetes diagnosis, and the source explicitly notes this, quote, shifted the burden of managing his health care on Emma's shoulders, his partner. That's the insight. The man's self-neglect often becomes a relational burden carried by his partner.
And the sources even have a term for the impact on the partner: caregiver burnout.
Mm-hmm. They define it clearly: the physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion from taking care of their male partners. The material emphasizes this as a significant, often really unacknowledged toll.
Those online forum discussions in our sources painted such raw, vivid pictures of this. Partners sharing stories of trying, often desperately, to get their partners to address health issues.
And on often meeting resistance. Yeah, like partners talking about men refusing doctor visits despite really alarming symptoms. One mentioned symptoms that screamed stroke risk factors being ignored. Another described signs that later turned out to be pancreatic cancer. Others talked about chronic, painful gallbladder issues, severe sleep apnea, all just dismissed or downplayed by the partner.
God, the emotional cost of that resistance comes through so strongly.
It really does. The partners in these accounts talk about feeling deeply resentful, feeling like they have to hide their partner's unhealthy habits, maybe out of embarrassment, or maybe just trying to manage the overwhelming stress of it all alone. It creates this dynamic of intense frustration and isolation for the partner, who often feels responsible but powerless.
It sounds incredibly lonely, like they're constantly walking on eggshells.
One source actually uses that exact phrase. It touches on that dynamic, suggesting that while the man's resistance to self-care might not be a conscious, deliberate attack on the partner, it can absolutely feel like one. Especially, as the source puts it, if the man is so fragile that he has made you walk on eggshells around his health, or his emotions, or his needs.
So any attempt to bring it up is met with such defensiveness or fragility that the partner just learns it's easier, though damaging in the long run, to manage it themselves or just stay quiet.
Exactly. And that fragility, that defensiveness, connects right back to those attitude blocks. The sources discuss these internal barriers preventing men from engaging properly with self-care or even emotional expression.
Right, those all-or-nothing misconceptions.
False dichotomies that trap men. The first one mentioned is strength versus vulnerability, that core belief that seeking help, needing rest, showing emotion is inherently weak.
Which loops back to the man roles again.
Precisely. The second block is success versus self-indulgence. This is the belief that taking time for self-care, whether it's getting enough sleep, exercising, eating well, taking a mental health day, is somehow unproductive, lazy, or a distraction from the real work of achieving or providing.
So anything not directly productive in that narrow traditional sense gets labeled as a frivolous luxury.
Pretty much. And the third block is stoicism versus emotional expression. This is the barrier that says men should maintain this rigid, emotionless front and actively avoid anything seen as less manly, which could mean avoiding therapy, avoiding deep emotional talks, even avoiding certain hobbies or interests.
These blocks sound like powerful internal handcuffs, constantly reinforced by those external cultural messages.
They really are. And the sources wisely contrast these limiting beliefs with a healthier, more expansive view. The real insight offered is that true strength isn't about never being vulnerable. Often, it includes the strength to seek help when needed.
And self-care isn't indulgence.
No, it's a fundamental investment in your long-term capacity, your well-being. And emotional expression isn't weakness. It's absolutely vital for your own health and for the health of your relationships.
And these blocks don't just hinder personal well-being. They severely impact relationship communication, which the sources also delve into quite deeply.
Yes, they highlight several common communication challenges often seen with male partners, and stonewalling gets particular emphasis. The sources define it as withdrawing from an interaction, refusing to participate or engage, basically shutting down completely during conflict.
And there's that really striking statistic cited from Gottman's research.
85% of Gottman's stonewallers are male.
Yeah.
It's a significant number.
And it's not always just stubbornness, is it? There's a physical aspect.
The sources explain that, yeah. There's often a physiological component. The heart rate accelerates, making it physically difficult to think clearly or process information rationally during a heated argument. It can be a kind of biological overwhelm leading to withdrawal.
But
But
the impact is the same, regardless of the cost.
exactly, the impact on the partner, on the communication, on the relationship is the same. Everything just stops cold. The connection is broken.
And this often seems connected to another issue the sources raise, resisting a partner's influence.
Mm-hmm. Frequently linked in the sources to a fear of a loss of power in the relationship. If a man's been culturally conditioned to see himself as, the primary decision maker, the one who knows best, or just the one who doesn't need to be told what to do, then genuinely listening to his partner, being influenced by her perspective, well, that can feel threatening to that ingrained identity or power dynamic.
And the result, when that resistance happens,
Gridlock. The sources use that specific term. It describes when couples get perpetually stuck on the same issues because one partner, often the man, according to the research cited, is unwilling to genuinely consider or be swayed by the other's viewpoint. They just dig their heels in.
leading to constant, unresolved conflict.
Right. And these negative communication patterns are often interconnected.
Like the Four Horsemen.
Exactly. The sources list Gottman's four horsemen: criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling as telltale signs that a man is resisting his wife's influence and that the relationship is heading for trouble.
Maybe we should quickly clarify those we haven't fully defined. Criticism isn't just complaining, right?
No, criticism is attacking the partner's personality or character, like saying, "You're always so lazy," instead of, "I'm frustrated the trash wasn't taken out." Defensiveness is seeing yourself as the victim, making excuses, or maybe counterattacking instead of hearing the complaint.
And contempt. That one sounds particularly bad.
It's considered the most damaging. It's treating your partner with disrespect, mockery, sarcasm, eye-rolling, name-calling. It conveys disgust, essentially. And then stonewalling, as we covered, is just shutting down and checking out. These are the destructive patterns the sources highlight as major roadblocks.
Okay, so it paints a pretty challenging picture, layering the internal pain, the cultural pressures, the self-neglect, these difficult communication styles. But the sources don't just leave us there, thankfully. They offer a clear focus on pathways forward towards healing, towards building stronger connections. Where did they start that part of the conversation?
A really major emphasis across the board in these sources is on developing emotional intelligence and healthy communication skills.
Yeah.
One source puts it quite simply: emotional intelligence is key to a lasting marriage.
So it's bigger than just knowing your own feelings.
Oh, much bigger. The sources describe it as a whole skill set. It includes things like genuinely honoring and respecting your partner, actively listening, really listening and validating their perspective, even if you see it differently.
Understanding their underlying needs, too.
Yes, and expressing empathy. The core insight seems to be that emotional intelligence in a relationship is fundamentally about orienting towards your partner with respect, curiosity, and understanding.
And the sources give some practical examples of what that looks like.
They do. Really simple, concrete actions sometimes, like setting aside distractions, putting the phone down, turning the TV off when your partner really needs to talk. Consciously choosing language that reflects we instead of just me.
And that idea of turning towards.
Right, turning towards your partner's bigs for connection. Those little moments, often really small, where they reach out for interaction, attention, affection, or support. The sources suggest actively noticing and responding positively to those bids rather than ignoring them or turning away.
That feels like the direct opposite of stonewalling, doesn't it?
It really is. It's an active choice to engage, to connect. But, like you hinted, it does start internally. The sources really stress that recognizing your own feelings is the beginning of healthy communication. You can't effectively communicate what you need if you don't even know what you're feeling inside.
And they even suggested some tools for building that self-awareness.
Yeah, they mentioned resources like Dr. Gloria Wilcox's Feelings Wheel or Marshall Rosenberg's List of Universal Human Needs, things that can help people put a name to the specific emotions they're experiencing and identify the underlying needs that might be driving those feelings or causing conflict.
So communication shifts from being about blame or complaint.
To being about expressing your feelings and your unmet needs. Exactly. There's this core idea stated explicitly in the sources. Communication is about people trying to get their needs met.
That's a powerful reframe.
Isn't it? When you start looking at conflict through that lens, understanding that maybe your partner's frustration is really about an unmet need for, say, consideration or support, and your own anger stems from an unmet need for respect or autonomy, it can dramatically lower the defensiveness.
It shifts the focus from who's right and who's wrong.
Exactly. It becomes, okay, what do we each actually need here, and how can we find a way for both of us to get closer to having those needs met?
So conflict resolution becomes more collaborative, based on understanding and meeting needs.
Yes. The sources describe it as a process involving that active listening first, making sure your partner feels genuinely heard and understood, even if you disagree with their conclusion, then clearly stating what you need, and finally, being willing to compromise to find that common ground. The key insight is that healthy conflict resolution isn't about winning an argument, it's about mutual understanding and finding solutions that work for the we, for the relationship.
Okay, so that's the relational side. What about strategies for personal healing and well-being that the sources suggest men can pursue individually?
Well, first, they identify some common unhealthy coping mechanisms that men might default to, like throwing themselves into something else to an unhealthy level.
Distraction tactics.
Basically, yeah, could be excessive work, becoming obsessive about a hobby, maybe engaging in risky behaviors, anything that serves as an intense distraction to avoid facing difficult internal problems, emotions.
Like trying to outrun the pain by just staying incredibly busy or seeking external highs.
Precisely. And in contrast, the sources highlight the real benefits of healthy hobbies. Activities pursued for genuine enjoyment, maybe skill building or connection, not just for avoidance. They link these to tangible benefits like fewer symptoms of depression and greater overall happiness.
And they circle back to the importance of self-care again here.
They do, but with a really important nuance. It's not just, bubble baths and spa days, that those things can be fine. The sources frame self-care much more fundamentally. It's presented as an essential investment, not self-indulgence. It's crucial for maintaining your capacity to maintain productivity and achieve long-term success.
But they broaden the definition of productivity and success too, right?
Yes, this is key. It's part of what one source calls transcending false dichotomies, making self-care relational. The insight here is critical. Your personal self-care choices or your neglect of self-care aren't just about you.
They impact the relationship.
Directly, they affect your capacity to show up, be present, contribute positively to your relationships, your family. Neglecting your physical or mental health doesn't make you a stoic hero. It often, as we saw with Michael's story, makes you a burden or creates distance. So true self-care becomes relational because it enhances your ability to be a good partner, a present parent, a connected human being.
That really reframes self-care. It's almost like a responsibility within the relationship, not just a personal option.
That's a great way to put it. And, some of the most powerful advice on this personal healing journey actually comes from that Reddit user we mentioned earlier, the one who went through those tough relationships.
What do they share about their process?
They distilled their healing into these really potent steps. Things like learning to fall in love with himself, which implies building that internal self-worth, self-acceptance, independent of anyone else's approval. Learning to set healthy boundaries.
Recognizing red flags.
Yes, recognizing unhealthy behaviors, those flags, in himself and in potential partners. Actively building character and self-esteem through actions that align with his values. Really understanding his own morals and values. And learning that very difficult but crucial skill of knowing when to connect and when to disconnect from relationships based on whether they're actually healthy or harmful.
Wow, that sounds like a deep internal rebuilding project.
It really does. And it connects strongly with another idea from the sources. That genuine healing often involves getting to the deep reason why someone might have tolerated abuse or unhealthy dynamics in the past.
Why they put up with it.
Right. The insight is that tolerating mistreatment often isn't random. It's frequently linked to a lack of internal validation, love, and worth. Finding those things within yourself is presented as the key to reaching a point where you no longer feel the need to tolerate that kind of behavior from others.
And alongside all this crucial internal work, the sources consistently emphasize the value of reaching out, of seeking external support.
Yes, it's framed almost as a benchmark of healing. Feeling more connected to others is a positive sign that you're healing, suggesting a move away from isolation. Building strong relationships and forming deeper, more meaningful relationships built on mutual respect and understanding aren't just presented as outcomes of healing, but as active parts of the healing process itself.
What kinds of support did the sources specifically mention?
A few different avenues. Professional support is highlighted, seeing a trauma-informed therapist, engaging in counseling or therapy more generally. And also the value of support groups is mentioned, maybe men-specific groups or general support groups, where sharing experiences with others who get it can really reduce that feeling of being alone in the struggle.
How did the sources describe what therapy is like for men who might be hesitant?
It's presented as a safe, structured container, a place where men can process what they're experiencing without judgment. And crucially, it's described as having No pressure and no expectations. You go at your own speed. The insight seems to be that therapy provides a guided, confidential space to explore difficult feelings and experiences that might feel too overwhelming or too culturally forbidden to talk about elsewhere.
The sources also touched briefly on navigating feedback, especially tricky feedback related to relationships or broader social issues.
Yeah, there was a useful note about developing the skill to distinguish between, say, a partner venting frustration, which might involve strong emotion but is ultimately about the issue, and a personal attack, which targets you. And also, relatedly, the challenge of learning how to hear criticism directed at a demographic you belong to, like hearing about the impacts of patriarchy without immediately letting your ego shut down or getting defensive.
So learning to listen for the core message, even if the delivery isn't perfect or it feels uncomfortable.
Right. And being willing to look inward, to consider it, rather than just dismissing it out of hand. It's about separating the message from the messenger sometimes
Hmm.
and engaging with the substance.
Okay. And finally, the sources address this really important theme of adapting identity, which feels especially relevant when life inevitably throws curveballs like illness or major changes.
Yeah. Absolutely. This section looks at how things like illness or disability can really challenge a man's traditional sense of self, particularly if that identity is heavily tied to roles like being the physical provider or protector. But the core insight isn't that these challenges break you, it's that they require adaptation.
That story about the man with MS coaching softball was such a poignant example.
It really was. The source tells how this father, dealing with MS, could no longer physically run around coaching his daughter's softball team from the field like he used to. But he didn't just give up, he adapted. He found a way to keep coaching, verbally, offering guidance and support from the sidelines. His physical abilities changed, but his role as a coach, as a father, as a mentor, that didn't have to disappear.
And the source highlighted the impact of that adaptation beyond just himself.
Exactly. It was used as this powerful example of finding different solutions, and how simply just showing up, even in that modified way, was teaching the girls not to give up. It beautifully illustrates how we can broaden our definition of productivity or contribution beyond just physical ability or earning money.
It includes things like maintaining relationships, caring for family, teaching life lessons, just being present.
And adapting to change, learning new strategies, finding new ways to contribute and connect when the old ways aren't possible anymore. That's explicitly stated in the sources as being key to good emotional health. It's about flexibility, resilience, and finding meaning and value even when circumstances shift.
Wow. We've really covered a lot of ground today. Guided by these diverse sources, we've looked deep into the intricate landscape of men's emotional lives and relationships.
Yeah, exploring the weight of past trauma, the pervasive influence of those cultural pressures, and the internal battles with shame.
The significant impact that self-neglect can have on partners, and those communication roadblocks, stonewalling, defensiveness that can really gridlock a relationship.
And crucially, we've also seen the clear, practical pathways towards healing and building stronger connections that these sources consistently point towards.
Things like developing emotional intelligence, fostering healthy needs-based communication.
The vital importance of self-care, but reframed as relational, building genuine self-worth from the inside out.
And the undeniable power of seeking support, connecting with others, and learning to adapt to life's changes.
What really stands out, I think, when you put all these pieces from the sources together is the sheer interconnectedness of it all. The internal pain is shaped by the external pressures, which then impact self-care and communication styles, which in turn profoundly affect relationships.
It's all linked. And threading through everything is this consistent, ultimately hopeful message that healing, growth, creating more fulfilling relationships, it's all deeply tied to cultivating vulnerability, developing emotional intelligence, deepening self-awareness, and actively seeking connection and support.
These sources collectively underscore that this journey, well, it isn't always easy. It's rarely a straight line. There will absolutely be challenges, maybe setbacks. But the possibility of navigating that adversity, of finding ways to adapt when things change, and discovering new avenues to be productive, and most importantly, deeply connected, that possibility is always presented as being there.
So let's leave you with this thought, kind of a synthesis drawn from the wisdom across these sources, echoing that sentiment from the softball story. Life isn't about having the fastest car or the biggest house. It's about caring about others and letting them care about you. It's about learning how we as people can always adapt and never give up. So as you reflect on everything we've unpacked today, maybe ask yourself, what does adapting and not giving up look like for you in your own life or your relationships right now?